स्पोर्ट्स से जुड़ी किसी भी छोटी या बड़ी अपडेट के लिए सब्सक्राइब करें स्पोर्ट्स तक और साथ ही किसी भी नोटिफिकेशन को पाने के लिए बेल आइकन को दबाना ना भूलें।
It's IPL time soon, and one of the focus areas always is how fit our players would be, and this time around that would be a focus area, particularly because the World Cup's around the corner as well. Someone who understands these issues very well has been the Indian head team physio, and now works closely with Rajasthan Royals, the physio of the side. John Gloster is with us. John, the simplistic opinion always is, well, IPL's 20 overs of action, 4 overs of cricket that the bowler has to deliver, batsman has to bat perhaps 5, 10, 15 overs. There would only be so much workload, but there are so many other areas, isn't it? Why this, on a fitness front, IPL does pose a challenge to a player?
Yeah, very much so. And I think the game has matured so much over the last 10 or 12 years since IPL came to the fore. But it's now more about understanding what we call their cumulative loads are, what their loads are over the year, not just the 2 months of that tournament, but what their loads are leading into the tournament. And then what they've got coming up straight after the tournament. This year being a very unique year because the IPL is followed directly by the World Cup. So not only are we looking at the performances and load management during the IPL, for our players we need to look at the big picture, which is World Cup, following that for many of the players within the franchises. So it's a difficult year for us from that perspective, but also makes us a lot smarter and a little bit more aware of what strategies we need to have in place to protect those players. One thing we have got a lot better at over the last couple of years is looking at data and understanding how data can help us make those decisions around what I call risk mitigation. We need to sort of manage risk around injury much, much better. And the more information we have on the player, the better we can do that. And certainly the catapult data that we collected last year at Rajasthan has given us a real insight into load, because it's load, particularly with fast bowlers, and poor load management and workload management that actually is the biggest injury precursor. So if we can manage that side of it, we can reduce injury risk significantly. So that's one thing that we've been able to do this year.
One of the things about IPL dressing rooms is that obviously there are cricketers around the world that with diverse cricketing background that come in. So would you tackle a player who comes in playing say Test cricket in New Zealand, then joins the Indian summer at the IPL a little bit differently to a player who's been playing one-day cricket in the subcontinent and then joins the IPL bandwagon?
Very much, because particularly if they're coming from Test cricket, because the workload, again, on the back of data that we've collected over the last few years, we know that the workloads of a Test cricketer, even though his perceived exertion rates may be 100%, he is still significantly down on the efforts that are required for him in especially high-speed running efforts that are required for him in T20 format. So preparation, we need to tackle that player at least 1 month out from the IPL to ensure that he's prepared for those efforts. So communicating, or my communication with other cricket boards around the world, is really, really important to ensure the best interest of the player for me for the T20 tournament, but also for that player going into a tournament straight after, again, in this case, the World Cup. So understanding the differences between efforts and load within each format of the game is crucial. And then looking at the environmental factor, that is a really big thing. They're coming into India in the middle of summer, and even within India, the variances are huge between a dry heat in Jaipur to humidity in Chennai, for example, and managing other factors of that player, particularly recovery. So into the mix here comes things like hydration monitoring. We monitor things very closely, such as recovery, and then looking at other key areas that I believe are perhaps the biggest influences on recovery and injury, which is nutrition. So this year we're drilling down again into nutrition. We're looking at how better to manage the food of players. So every year we need to get a little bit smarter, but it's all about protecting our asset, the player being our assets. And if you look at the IPL and some of the numbers that are involved with IPL, you need to consider these players as assets. And the best way to get a return on your asset is to look after that asset. So my responsibility is to ensure that those players are well looked after physically and mentally. And when we address the mental side of the game now, we've got probably the best guy in the business with Paddy Upton with us again this year to manage that side of the players. So we're now looking at a more complete monitoring of the overall individual throughout the tournament.
So while we are at it of the IPL and the proximity to the World Cup, the other challenge perhaps IPL throws up is limited recovery time between matches, which is always a challenge. It's something that you need to weigh in as well, because the thing with Royals is this time around you got a lot of players around the world, perhaps a lot of overseas players who might have to rush into World Cup action after the IPL.
Yeah, and so again, that communication loop between myself and the various cricket boards from where these players have come has to be open and very sort of dual in nature. So communicating is the key, I believe. We also need to understand that they have a responsibility to their country as well as to the franchise, and we need to weigh that up. But my management of the individual doesn't change. It's the individual at the end of the day who I need to treat, and I need to treat appropriately. But the better they are and the better prepared they are, the better they'll perform for us, and the less risk of them being injured for the tournaments that are coming up afterwards. So, but that doesn't matter whether they're an international player, whether they're from another country, whether they're a local Indian player, whether they're a domestic player, it doesn't matter. Every player is treated the same when it comes to those key categories of injury risk mitigation, as well as recovery, and as well as performance monitoring. Every player is managed the same.
Interesting that you talk about the strength of how that data may help you and the other cricket boards as well. I know that there are not too many Indian players who might, in the Royals camp, who might be playing in the World Cup. But where we had this debate and you're an expert at it, there are some suggestions to say that you limit a player's game match play to a certain number of games in the IPL. That may not probably be the best way of going about it, because this data may give a more informed opinion as to how much a player can play, at what stage they can play, and this is perhaps a strategy that a lot of franchises might adopt based on the medical advice that they receive from the Indian camp, perhaps.
Yeah, and like I said before, the biggest injury risk for a player is poor workload management. That's what actually produces most injuries, particularly in young fast bowlers. You've got to look at other categories as well, and the other categories being age. We know that young fast bowlers under the age of 25 have a 5 times greater risk of developing a lumbar stress injury through overwork than somebody who's over 25. So we need to consider other factors as well, but the primary one being workload management, and having that data available allows me to manage that much better than anybody else. So we can almost predict risk and injury risk, but it allows us to keep playing the players in the match situations, but be more aware of how they're training and what they're doing between those match situations. So that's where we're getting a lot smarter, and I think the other franchises are now looking at that as well. But I always like to think that we at Rajasthan Royals are always at the forefront of thinking in this space, and we're very lucky to have someone like Stephen Jones on board, who comes from a sports science background, but also comes from a fast bowling background. Having played 140 plus first-class matches himself, he knows the day in and day out of fast bowling, but he's now able to adapt that to his sports science background and understand that the player, we mustn't forget the player as being an individual human being as well as something that we're collecting data on. So he keeps it human, if you want to put it that way, but also respecting the fact that science and data is giving us a lot of information that is very, very useful about managing and monitoring that human being as well.
You just touched upon a bowler's susceptibility to an injury, perhaps, and the mechanisms through which you did a research recently. In Indian cricket, Jasprit Bumrah is the Virat Kohli of Indian bowling, the way he's been able to sort of get this effectiveness going. His unorthodox action works for him. It's obviously a benefit, because a lot of batsmen probably don't see the ball as well as early as they might. So that's one school of thought. But does this action also put a strain on the body? What's the expert opinion on? What's the research findings that you found out?
There are many bowlers out there, even in our setup, who have different actions, and I think that's the unique part of the modern game, is that there are players out there who are different. We want players who are different in the game, and is that a risk in itself? Not necessarily. Like I said, there's so many other factors we need to consider that sort of predict risk for us and injury. Management of that player. An individual may have an unusual action, but if their workload is managed properly, their preparation and strength and stability training is managed properly, their nutrition's managed properly, their recovery protocols are managed properly, they're in an age bracket where they're not at risk, they're above 25, then there's no reason why that individual should get injured more than anybody else with a what we call a normal action. So it's about, I often say this, that the body, if you give it time, will adapt to anything. And that goes from marathon running in bare feet to whatever you want to do. The body eventually, if you give it time to adapt, will do it, and give it the right strategies to protect itself. So our role as physios and trainers and S&C and sports science professionals is to educate the player about how to protect themselves. And the best way to protect yourselves is to build your own protective mechanism, which is the muscles around your skeletal system. So we know in fast bowlers that the most at-risk structure is the lumbar spine, the low back for stress fractures. We're very well versed about how to mitigate that risk. So all we need to do now is implement that with these individuals and ensure that they follow those programs through and those protocols through. And but like I said, it's that workload management that's actually the key to reducing injury in fast bowlers.
On the action front, your research doesn't suggest any need for change in Bumrah's case?
There's an old saying in sports medicine. Well, in my profession, I use the saying that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I've seen marathon runners out there who have, running techniques that you would, if you saw them in a video, you'd tell them to stop running because they're going to injure themselves. But they're out there breaking world records in marathons. So, the same goes for anybody in any sport, that if their history doesn't suggest that they're going to get injured and they don't have an injury history, then they must be doing something right. So again, I look at history. We look at screening data that we get off players, but I don't base anything on that. I base it on their history and whether they have a high injury history. If they do, then we may need to monitor and modify things. If they don't, then we just monitor them and only implement a strategy if they then get injured. And that's about, I think we can't overcomplicate it more than that, it's, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
My final point on this, and there's an opinion that Michael Holding suggested to Bumrah when he was an expert working with the India-South Africa series. He said that his action his run-up is limited, so there is probably a little bit more stress on his body in the delivery stride. Perhaps you can look at a longer run-up. Now, Michael Holding had one of the best actions in the business, but it may or may not work for Bumrah. Do you see merit in that?
The thing about fast bowlers, and again, we come back to look at where most injuries occur in fast bowlers. And it occurs if the fast bowler doesn't what we call maintain momentum through the crease. So for me, more important is that momentum through the crease and carrying the body in a direction towards the batsman without manoeuvring through too many planes between the lower part of the body and the upper part of the body. So if all that's correct, then the finishing touches to a fast bowler is their run-up. And Stephen Jones talks a lot about a fast bowler's run-up because that's where you create momentum. So ultimately your momentum at the crease and how you deliver the ball is sort of the end result of how you run up to the crease. Some guys do it better than others, and it's an area of the game that I think we're starting to look a lot closer at. And because we now understand more about momentum at the crease. So fast bowlers, for me, to be effective fast bowler, to reduce your injury risk as much as possible, we need to look at the complete cycle from the beginning of your run-up to how you exit the crease area after you've delivered the ball. So it's first about momentum to the crease and then about how you dissipate load safely once you've delivered the ball. So if you've got all those bases covered, then you're reducing risk significantly just by sort of assessing and looking at those key factors of the fast bowler's cycle.
My final question to you, how much of a transformation do you see in Indian cricket in terms of the fitness parameters, this Virat Kohli-led outfit of you've been the part of the system and then and now?
One thing I've always said about Indian cricket, and this was sort of my mantra when I first came to the team, was for a team to be successful and consistently successful, you need to piece together two key ingredients. One is the technical, and I believe that the subcontinent players, particularly the Indian players, are the best technical players in the world. And I don't think anyone would argue with that. So what was the missing ingredient in terms of being consistent at the highest level? The other key ingredient being fitness. And I think what we've done now is we've made fitness non-negotiable. and certainly Virat has brought that to the table, and for that I applaud him. And they've now combined the fitness with the technical, and we've seen the results. And I think that has been, there was a lot of discussion and around the yo-yo test and the merits for that. Despite the discussion around that, the key underlying theme there was that we are going to test you on fitness, and fitness is non-negotiable, because in order for us to be successful and be consistent at the highest level in all forms of the game, we have to ensure that we're marrying the fitness with the technical. And for me, that's been the greatest change in Indian cricket. If myself and Andrew and Greg King and Adrian and these guys played a small part in ensuring that momentum carried through, then that's great, and I'm happy to say that. But for me, once you set a bar and a standard, then you've got to keep pushing that. So the next challenge will be how they continue to push those bars and standards. And I think that's through data, and I think it's through tech. And I think that's why we at Rajasthan Royals have embraced that, because we believe that's the way that we're going to get to go to the next level as well. And that's what we're going to be consistently pushing, and the message I'm consistently pushing is we need to embrace that going forward.